Makepakepika. And welcome to this session of Brown Bag Biography, the longest running seminar series at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Today's session is number 796. It started in the mid-1980s under the aegis of George Simpson, the founder of the center, and is being organized and supported by Zoe Sprout and Paige Rasmussen, the managing editor of the journal Biography and the manager of the center. Before I introduce our speakers and our participants for today, I just want to give you a bit of information about upcoming talks. A week from today, April 7th, same time, same location, we will be having a presentation called Trouble Enough, Enslaved Women's Testimony as an Ethics of Care. That will be with Elizabeth Colville. Her abstract, How Might Stories of Violence and Acts of Witness Long Buried in Colonial Archives Speak to Our Own Violent Present? In 1793, in the heat of revolution in Saint-Dominique, now Haiti, women of African descent testified before government officials about brutal acts committed by a slaveholder couple in the colonial city of Cap Français. In this talk, I draw on Christina Sharp's work on Black survival, improvisation, and an ethics of care to think through the implications of these radical 18th century acts of witness. And then the following week, April 14th, Ron Williams, who is working at the State Archives, is going to be giving a talk on From Research to Curriculum, Grassroots Strategies for Getting Your Life Stories into Classrooms. And what he's going to be doing is giving an illustrated presentation on the Kalakapo'ealoha'aina Kanakauiwi, the Native Hawaiian Patriot Card Project that has delivered new primary source research from the archives of Hawaii directly into over 150 classrooms through Ko Hawaii Pai'aina for free, without the support of grants, the university, or the Department of Education. Both methodology and content access will be discussed with the goal of inspiring similar grassroots projects that allow local communities and peoples more power to affect change in the education of their haumana. Okay. General announcements and housekeeping. Zoe, when she's sorted out what she's working on at the moment, will put the CBR mailing list in the chat. And you can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for updates. The Q&A will be run through the chat function because of security issues we've had to deal with in the past. There will be a sort of no public chat. You send the questions to Zoe and she will then put them into the public chat and I'll direct them verbally to the question to your speaker. This is recorded and posted on YouTube, so if you don't want to be identified, you should be aware that your name will actually appear there. And also, if we do, and I hope we will, have the time to have discussion and whatever, if we do recognize who you are, you can, in fact, request to Zoe that you would like to speak. And if we recognize who you are, we can unmute and even let your camera go. It's just we hit into some racist bombing problems a few weeks ago that we don't want to repeat. Okay. Now, I'm going to ask quickly for an update here. Paige, do we have a notion of who all's in?
We do have John Osorio just arrived in.
Okay. But we don't have Tasha.
Zoe is still working on it.
Okay. All right, let me just get things started and we will bring him back in as soon as we are able to. The idea for this project started probably at the time that we realized that Teresia had passed. An incredibly important figure in the Pacific whose story and own history has been integral to all of her work and all of her influence. We were aware that there would be various kinds of commemoration, and one of the most important and heartfelt and wide-ranging is the one that we're celebrating here today, the collection Sweat and Sweetwater. We're particularly interested in this because in addition to recognizing an incredibly important and inspiring life, it's also tied to how we actually commemorate those lives, how people get together and figure out what is the appropriate way of preserving a legacy, of acknowledging the contribution, and in as many ways as possible, moving things on with that presence still there. It's something we're very interested in at the Center for Biographical Research. We feel incredibly honored that the three people who were responsible for putting this collection together have agreed to join us today, and also that our moderator just actually appeared on screen. So what I will do here is introduce our moderator, who is going to organize the discussion and offer his own comments. This is Teresias Tara Kabutalaka, who is an associate professor and director of the University of Hawaii Center for Pacific Island Studies. He's a political scientist who has written extensively on governance and geopolitical issues in the Pacific Islands with a focus on Solomon Islands. He has researched and written on China and geopolitics in the Pacific Islands, natural resources and economic development, conflicts, and international interventions. Prior to joining the University of Hawaii in 2009, he was a fellow at the East-West Center for 6 years. He was previously a lecturer in history and political science at the University of the South Pacific in Fiji. He has a remarkable background and also a background that is fully engaged with the topic of our discussion today. I also happen to notice here, though, before we move there, that John Osorio is with us. Hello, my John, and Heoli Osorio. And before we move into the discussion, I'm going to pass things over to John, who can explain what they're going to be doing.
We're just unmuting here. Hopefully everyone can hear us. Aloha mai kako. It's a really great pleasure for Jamaica and I to be here and to be able to honor our sister, Teresia Teaiwa. And Katerina's here. Katerina, so good to see you. So grateful for everything that you were able to do to be able to get our song to her. In time. It was such a sad time back in 2017. And the writing of this song, like several other really important songs in our life, just came very, very quickly and very, very easily. It is a song that really celebrates what we know about this remarkable public woman, and the work that she did and the people whose lives she so deeply affected. But it's also a personal song that comes from a long and deep friendship that I had with her going back to the days that we were students together at the East-West Center, taking courses from professors and giving them a really hard time. So it's our pleasure to do this song. I presume we should just get right into it.
Get on with it.
And of course, okay, so the other part of this song is that I started to write the song, the first verse and the chorus, and then I called the people who also knew her and loved her and who were poets and asked them to each write a verse. Liz Soto and Heoli Meli Kalani Osorio. And so this is a song that is a song that we wrote together and contains slightly different perspectives as you come through it. And it seems so appropriate when we talk about her and her work and her approach to life. So many perspectives, such incredible diversity among our people. Old men gaze to the horizon where the women see forever, and the stories of their lives become unspoken by the gods. I have known you, Teresia, by your love for all your islands, and I sing your name with gladness for the
Teresia by and by. Oh, guardian of this ocean, our grand Moana Nui, mother, sister, auntie, who shoulders all our fears, who writes the songs and psalms and words that carry rising tides. We hold them in the baskets you showed us how to tie.
Teresia Teaiwa, I kamoku kelea ui te Tierra nuestra Teresia.
In this wondrous sea that greets us, I will see you, Teresia, by and by.
Toward the distant waves that beckon us to search and to discover, to set your faith and joyful voice, to sing your people's praise. And they know you, Teresia, in 1,000 ancient languages, along the alma of the poet and the sage. Oh, come on, Teresia Teaiwa, I kamoku kelea ui Tierra nuestra Teresia.
In this wondrous sea that greets us, I will see you, Teresia, by and by. I will see you, Teresia, by and by.
Hallelujah.
Mahalo.
And now I will happily pass things over to Tara, who I'm very glad to see.
Oh, there. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm really sorry. I've been struggling to get on the Zoom. I'm now using my phone. I couldn't get on my computer. But first, let me take the opportunity to thank you and to thank the Center for Biographical Study for Center for Biographical Research for organizing and inviting us. Now, mama now hamusui rongona hitasai dalineni tutuhunu manavai rongoni. May now mama now hira tamanina vera hira I Hawaii hira kanaka maule and mama now wani I John Osorio my keoli hinia linge. So thank you very much for having me and thank you for giving me the opportunity to facilitate this. My role is simply as a facilitator, and thank you to John and Holly for that beautiful song that you shared with us. I think we are gathered here to do two things. One is to share about a book, but more importantly, to share the stories and scholarship of someone that we all hold so dearly. And that is Teresia Teaiwa and her book, or the book that has her collection of her writings, Sweat and Salt Water, which is a selection of work that she's done over the years. And I think the book is a significant contribution to Pacific Island studies in particular, and scholarship more generally. It covers a wide range of issues, from Pacific studies to militarism, to gender, to native reflections, to creative writings, a reflection of the breadth and depth of Teresias scholarship. And I'm participating in two capacities. The first is as a colleague to Katerina, to April, and Terence, who edited or compiled Teresias' work into this book. And secondly, as somebody who is a colleague to Teresia as well. So I first met Terry at the University of the South Pacific many years ago, where we started our career together. And I remember in those days, we used to have gatherings, and we called ourselves the Yaks, which means the young academics. And we would get together on Fridays, have a few drinks, and talk about the issues that were important to us and important to the region as well. But later on, we had more organized group known as the New Waves. And we would get together and write poetry and have performances at traps. And those of you who are familiar with Suva in Fiji would know that this was one of the popular bars in Suva in those days. I'm not sure whether it is still popular nowadays. So Teresia was a colleague, a friend, and someone who was really dear to me, in fact, still dear to me. But I'm also here as the editor of the Pacific Islands monograph series, the series in which this book was published. And I think, PIMS is proud to be associated with this book project. I think that, in fact, PIMS and UH Press is the natural home for Teresia's scholarship. And this is not only because of the nature of her work on Pacific Island studies, but because of her connections to Hawaii, and in particular, the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And so what we're going to do today is have a conversation. So this will be a talanoa. So instead of having the presenters do presentations, we will have questions. And I assume that Craig has already introduced our speakers, Katerina Teaiwa, April Henderson, and Terence Wesley-Smith, who are the editors and the collectors or the compilers of this collection of writings by Teresia. And so what I'm going to do is go straight into the conversation. And I want to begin by asking Kati if she could share with us. Kati, as we all know, is a renowned scholar and recently an award-winning scholar, received the Australia Teaching Award. And congratulations as well, Kati, on the promotion to full professorship. But as a scholar yourself and having a sister like Terry, who was also a great scholar, I wonder if you could talk about growing up with her, growing up as a younger sister, but also as an emerging scholar, and now, renowned scholar as well. What was it like in terms of your relationship with her?
Vinaka Vakalevu Tara and Nisambula Vinaka and Kamna Maori to everyone gathered here. Thank you so much to Craig and your center for organizing this. I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people here in Canberra in Australia. And I acknowledge that they are the traditional owners of this land, and this land was never ceded, and we are settlers here. I haven't had my morning coffee, and after that amazing and beautiful song from John and Hayoli, I'm feeling like I definitely could have used that coffee to help me with my how I'm feeling right now. We recently had a wonderful celebration for the Teaching Award, and my sister was very much invoked in that context as well. And the whole of the Pacific came together in Canberra to celebrate that. And as I was watching all the different, it was quite hard to wrangle the Pacific together in this one space. And I kept thinking of her funeral and how all of that played out, and how the Pacific and Tangata Whenua and everyone had to come together and figure how to be the Pacific around her, and how she was someone who was able to inspire people to figure out how to do that, despite the diversity and the connections, the similarities and some of the tensions. She could figure out how to weave all of the different strands together. So growing up with her was like growing up with someone who was awfully competent at so many different things, and quite big sistery and bossy about it, a lot in that process. But her level of literacy, her level of Pacific literacy, her level of intellectual literacy, and her level of emotional literacy, and even as a Catholic, we're a Catholic family, her religious literacy was awfully high. It was awfully, awfully high. It was like dictionary level, encyclopedia levels of literacy. And that was quite overwhelming to be around sometimes. So she spoke, I think, about 5 languages quite competently, and was always adding more languages to her repertoire. For example, I can speak English, but I can barely speak Fijian and the Kiribati languages. So even though we grew up under the same roof with the same influences, we were not similar at all in terms of this level of literacy. So Teresia, as my father said in her funeral and in some other gatherings, would read the dictionary. She would read it from A to Z like she was reading a book. So she was hungry for knowledge. She soaked up knowledge. She soaked up facts and ideas and things about the world. And then, as many people noted, at her funeral and in other contexts and other pieces of writing, she always remembered everyone's names and everyone's details. So I do not have that same capacity. I can't remember and recall names in the same way. We have very different sorts of skill sets, but she was so inspiring in that her passion for the Pacific spilled out to the rest of the family, to everyone else who was around her. And she was the one who encouraged me to go for the Masters in Pacific Island Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa there, where most of you are, and to think about a scholarship through the East-West Center, which is something she received and my parents received, but I missed the deadline because I'm always a little bit behind. And so I became an affiliate of the East-West Center, and I lived at the East-West Center like she did, and many of you did, and my parents did, but I was always sort of following after her in a slightly less competent and slightly less focused sort of way. So there's, she's much older than me, so it wasn't like, there was just 2 or 3 years between us. And in the Pacific, when your sister is older than you in that way, they occupy both a sibling and a parenting role simultaneously. So she sort of had those dual hats of being like a mama and also like a big sister as well. But one of the things that she inspired, which I then did run with, which is something she had always wanted to do and didn't pursue, partly because of the ANU where I'm based, is the Banaban story, are the Banaban stories and Banaban histories and Banaban research. So she started her journey like me, but before me, wanting to know more about who we were and where we came from, how we ended up being minorities in Fiji, because the Banabans are a very small, displaced minority Micronesian community and a much larger, very multicultural, but also very politicized landscape that is Fiji. She wanted to know more about how we got there, and she wanted to know more about gender relations within that context, because it was quite obvious to us, being both of Kiribati and Banaban heritage, that gender relations play out in very specific ways amongst Banabans and Kiribati. So I was able to be inspired by that and achieve some of the things that she decided not to do because of the sheer colonialism of the kind of research about Banaban that comes out of the ANU. So I decided I would do it at the ANU, and I would smash it as much as possible as I could in this very powerful intellectual institution, which occupies a very specific sort of reputation in Pacific studies. So that was what it was like growing up with a sister like that, who was incredible, amazing, diverse in all her interests and her abilities. She wasn't perfect like any of us, but she was very powerful in so many different ways in terms of how much her passion was able to bring others with her on her Pacific learning journey. So thank you for asking me that, Tara, and I hope that gives you a little bit of insight into what it was like to be the little sister of Teresia Teaiwa.
Thank you, Kati. Let me now turn to April. April, you worked with Terry. You were a colleague, but she was also a kind of a mentor as well. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your relationship with her.
Sure. Thank you, Tara. I first saw Teresia present at the Contested Ground Conference, a quite infamous conference there at the East-West Center in Honolulu. When I was not even a student, an enrolled student at the time. I completed my BA and returned to Hawaii, where my mother was based, and had been told to attend this conference because it might be of interest to me. And it was a conference at which Teresia delivered an incredible paper called Yangona Yangongu, Roots and Roots of a Displaced Native, which is a paper that we have included in the edited collection, and returning to it as we were putting the collection together was hugely emotional, I suppose, because it sort of marked the bookends of my career to date, my sort of starting with my prehistory in Pacific Studies before I was even formally enrolled in a program in Pacific Studies in 1995, where I was just this sort of interested person who found myself at a conference when I wasn't even a student and beheld Teresia and was stunned. And then subsequently the following year enrolling at the Center for Pacific Island Studies in the same cohort as Katerina. So I came to know Teresia personally through my close relationship with Katerina, my fellow SIPA student and friend, and got to know Teresia a bit better. And then fast forward when I'd completed my master's and was doing research for my PhD, and I was doing my PhD at the History of Consciousness Department at University of California, Santa Cruz. And I had intentionally enrolled there because of the reputation of that program due to the students that it had produced prior to me going there, students such as Teresia herself, Kehalani Kawanui, and then probably the OG Pacific student there, Vince Diaz, Teresia's close friend. So I was doing my doctoral work and was visiting Wellington, and Teresia knew that I was coming, and at that point for the first 2 years had been the only full-time faculty member in Pacific Studies at Victoria University from her founding of the program in 2000 until the beginning of 2002. And she knew I was coming to town on a research stint for my PhD and brought me on board as a fixed term contract to give her some teaching relief. And then unbeknownst to me was working behind the scenes to spin it into a permanent position that she then encouraged me to apply for. So I just celebrated in March my 20th anniversary of living here in Te Whanganui Atara in Wellington, and never went home permanently, and ended up working with Teresia for 15 years. And so you had mentioned her mentoring. I mean, just echoing what Katerina has said about her voracious appetite for learning. It was intellectual knowledge, it was personal knowledge of people and their relationships. And it was also a voracious appetite for institutional knowledge. she was incredibly interested in figuring out how our institution worked and using and leveraging that knowledge to benefit our program, to benefit her colleagues, to benefit our students. And she was always trying to leverage all of this information that she was gathering and collecting to support everyone and to support their aspirations and success. So I've previously written elsewhere that oftentimes, she knew what people needed even before they recognized that they needed it. And many students and alumni of our program attest to this. And so she would always have this incredible skill of linking people together from whom great things would then spring, or linking people with opportunities, or sort of just knowing that this thing and her huge giant repertoire of awareness might be the perfect thing for that person over there, and putting these things together. And I think there's just countless stories that testify to that. And many of these were just emerging in the many different public memorials that were held for her here in Te Whanganui-a-Tara in Wellington. So me personally, I benefited extraordinarily from her support, from learning from the model that she set. And I know my dear colleague, Imalani Case, is joined with us today. I saw her join in. And Imalani and I, we talk about Teresia all the time. Imalani and I talk about the true legacy of Teresia pedagogically is in always being attentive and reflexive and trying to tweak our teaching that much more to make it more effective. So it was this, I use the word voracious, but sort of almost a relentless attentiveness to always trying to better her knowledge and better her practice. And Kati had mentioned how, none of us can really live up to the standard that she had for her incredible capacity for memory. But I don't know if any of us can hold ourselves really to the high standard she set for that, that work that she was constantly doing in her own practice, whether it was research, whether it was teaching. But we tried in the ways that we can, while also being attentive to the necessity of recognizing the conditions that we require to keep getting up and doing it every day. And I don't know, that might be a theme that I'll turn it over to Kati at some point later, because I know it's a theme that's very dear to Kati's heart in terms of speaking of the stakes and the costs of that relentless output of work for Teresia. Thank you.
Thank you, April. Terence, you know a lot of this, or you knew a lot of these people as students prior to them taking on careers, April, Kati. And although Teresia did not do a master's in Pacific Island Studies, she had very close relationship with Pacific Island Studies here at UH Manoa. And I'm not saying this to show how old you are, Terence, but it's just the fact that that you know these people in different capacities. And over the years, Terry became a really good friend. And I think, you were kind of a mentor, and you also learned a lot from her as well. And if you can talk a little bit about your relationship with her.
Yeah, I was thinking a few minutes ago when you mentioned traps, that's where I first met Katerina. We were visiting USP and we went down to Traps, and Terry introduced Kati. And Kati's heard the story before. She said, Terry said, "Oh, this is Terence from UH." And Kati said, without any niceties, she said, "Where's my application? I haven't heard anything from your program." So anyway, yeah, Terry and I worked together, or she worked with us at CPIS over decades and decades, and it became a very close relationship. Personally, I valued her friendship hugely. I valued her scholarship. You mentioned, Tara, that I learned a lot from her. I certainly did. And if you look at our publications, there's a sort of parallel conversation going on about Pacific studies, which was hugely rich for me. I first met Terry when she was in the history program at UH, and I was junior faculty at CPIS. We really didn't have any interaction. And I don't think I was one of those professors that John mentioned that they gave a hard time to. I managed to avoid that. But the first time I became aware of Terry and her power and her intellect and her capacity to bring people together was at the conference that April mentioned, Contested Ground, in 1995. That was sort of a breakthrough event for me personally or professionally. I was newly tenured, and I was given the responsibility to organize an international conference. And CPIS at that time did pretty large conferences. So this was my first conference, and it was a 3-day event. And I pulled out the program this morning. It's who's who of Pacific studies at the time. Ranganui Walker gave the keynote address. Lili Kilaa chanted. John Osorio, I see, was a moderator for one of the panels. But it was Teresia that really stole the show, because she gave, as April mentioned, she gave this paper, and halfway through it, she burst into tears, and the room was electric. It was just, it sort of pulled together that conference, which was the sort of point where, in my mind, where CPIS started on its decolonizing mission. And Teresia gave this presentation and then cried. And I remember driving home that night thinking, this is good, my conference is going well. And it's so good that Teresia cried, and how wonderful. And it sort of seemed to summarize a lot about what we were talking about Pacific studies should be: critical, emotional, personal. And of course, it was only later that I realized that Teresia cried at everybody's conference. So that was a bit deflating. But we had many interactions over the years, both in Wellington and here in Honolulu. She gave the keynote address at our 60th anniversary conference that many of you were at, if you remember. I didn't actually understand that keynote address too well, I seem to remember, but she was there. And then most recently was that marathon workshop we had just about a year before she passed away, where we launched the iBook Teaching Oceania series. And she was part of that collaboration that produced the first 4 iBooks in that series. Yeah, so Teresia, important to me intellectually and personally.
Thank you, Terence. Let's turn to the book. This wonderful book that the 3 of you have put together, which is a collection of her writing, but not all her writing. And I think there are more books, if not another book, that could do that. But I wanted to focus on this particular project and how it came about. And maybe I'll start with you, April, talking about how the 3 of you got together and work out the need for this book project, the need to put together a collection of Terry's work and put it out there for scholars, for students, for people more generally. So April, can you take us through that?
I don't know actually what I can definitively say. As the person who was solely tasked with holding together Victoria University's Pacific Studies program and the 10 PhD students that we were wrangling at the time, and also probably a key communication channel for a lot of everything in the immediate aftermath of Teresia's passing. I have to confess that there's very little I remember. But Terence very kindly said that, and I went back and looked at the email chain, and very kindly says that it was my idea, but I honestly can't remember that. And I know that I think Kati and Sean, in his preface to the volume, mentioned that Teresia herself had discussed, perhaps pulling together a collection of her essays. I know that at the time of her passing, Teresia was very focused on her monograph work on Fiji women soldiers. So I know the monograph was really the key baby that she was hoping to get out. But I'm sure that this would have been also a project that would have eventuated eventually had she remained with us. But in the immediate aftermath of her passing, I don't know, it just seemed like an obvious thing to do, I suppose. That's a.
Thanks, April. Let me turn to Kati. If you can talk a little bit about this project and what your reflections are.
Yeah, so when my sister was in hospital and she was diagnosed in January and she only had 7 weeks after that. So it was unfortunately very fast from diagnosis to her passing. My family was there in Wellington for a wedding, and we were staying with her. And my daughter I have 2 daughters, and one of my daughters was quite young. I was still breastfeeding her. And after the diagnosis, was kind of like trying to manage and support and help with what was going on with my sister, which was absolutely devastating. And then managing my family and essentially flying back and forth between Canberra and Wellington to try to be present. But because I had my baby with me, had to bring her into hospital regularly. And then there were some issues around, exposure and whether that was the best thing. But Terry's hospital room was often packed with people, unfortunately. I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, it got to the point where the hospital was like, here's the regular line for all humans, and here's the separate line for anyone wanting to visit Teresia Teaiwa, because it was that sheer scale of people and visitors and concern and outpouring of love for her that everyone had to be on top of while she was sick. And it was very interesting because that was actually, there was so much love, but that was actually an important time for her. And we all, and her friend Mele went, we needed to make space for her to be able to reflect and think and figure out what she wanted in terms of her legacy. So while trying to manage flows of people, and we got to that point where we had to put like messages and labels on doors and all kinds of things to say, so sorry, you can't visit Teresia Teaiwa right now. During that period, she was writing a lot of notes. She was talking to a couple of people. She was talking to her husband, Sean Mallon. She was talking to me. She was talking to April and a couple of other people from the university, and she had some ideas about what she wanted in terms of her legacy. One of them was the Victoria University scholarships that emerged that everyone passionately worked for and supported, and she donated herself out of her insurance money, which should have been for her family, but they all agreed some of it would go to students at Victoria University of Wellington to support Pacific Studies students going into the future. And then everyone else came together and fundraised more, and the university eventually put funds in. And so that was one of the things she most definitely wanted. In terms of her Pacific Studies legacy, was scholarships for students to continue to study in the field that she loved so much and that she was passionate about. And then people had to think about what to do in terms of her research, her writing, work that was still ongoing, her poetry. I mean, she was so prolific and productive. She had many things. She kept her laptop in the hospital, very, very close to her, and was very concerned about the fact that, our universities ask us to change our password every 3 seconds. She was like, I've got to change my password. I've got to change my password. It was like, no, let's think about other things. No, keep that laptop here so I can make sure I update it so I can check my emails. She was constantly thinking about the university, her job, her role, other people, and what would happen out of that. So what was going to happen in terms of her writing, she did want something to happen with the research that she was still doing, and Sean and I and others are still needing to think about that. Her poetry, a lot of it had been already out there in different forms. Some of it she self-published and handed to people in beautiful pamphlets. Some of it was in books. Lots of it was on the web in really interesting places and spaces. And then she had this amazing body of work that had been published in different books, different journals, different things. So for us, I think it was most obvious that the first thing that anyone could do, and April, April was very much on top of this and realized that, and suggested this is one of the things we could do. And Terence was like, yes, absolutely, and kind of jumped on board and ended up driving quite a lot of it, was to bring all her already published works together in one space. However, because it's so much and covers so many topics, and there was a lot of co-written pieces, co-authored, co-edited kinds of works, we decided to focus just on her sole authored works and on ones around the kinds of themes that eventually emerged in the book. So there was a lot of decision making to be done. It took some time, a lot of different hands and hearts and editorial eyes, and from Pacific Island Studies and from the monograph series and from graduate students and from others, all came together to try to help us make these decisions about which works covering which themes with a very tight word count limitation that we were also working within. Decisions had to be made, and we came to, I don't know if you want us to go into the themes just yet, but we came to the decisions that we did about the particular selections, the particular thematics, and then we decided the other works could emerge in other forms down the track. So I am thinking about her poetry, for example, and really was waiting for this one to be done first, just to get all her fantastic and impactful work in one space before we try to do justice to what was really, I think, closest to her heart, which was her poetry, which was her literary writing. I mean, since she was little, she was writing like that, so I almost felt like the published works, that was doable because they had already been through multiple rounds of thinking and selection, and there was still quite a lot of work to do to get it all into one format. But her poetry is something that I need to reflect on and think about with a lot of care and a lot of, reflection on what is the best way to put that out. So her impactful intellectual work, a good portion of it is in this book, according to the thematics that we decided, with Pacific Studies being front and center.
Thank you, Katia. That segues our conversation, Talanoa, into this particular book and the things that are in it. And Terence, I remember you talking to me about this collection, putting it together, and the possibility of the Pacific Islands monograph series as a place to publish, which I thought was only natural, and that PIMS is the best place to publish this work. But can you share your thoughts on the project, and then move on to talk about what Katia was talking about. How did the three of you come to decide, from the many work that Terry produced, which one would be included in this? And then perhaps later on, Terry, Katia, and April could also talk a little bit about what has not been published, and perhaps, you know, the possibility of putting that together in the future, like the poetry that Kati just mentioned. So, Terence.
Let me interrupt for just 1 second. Ordinarily, we end these sessions at the quarter hour, but because of the difficulties we had at the beginning, if our speakers are willing to continue on, I would guess that many of the people in the audience would like to as well. So we're just going to keep going because, frankly, this is wonderful. Sorry, I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Craig.
Yeah, you know, thinking about the origins of the project, it was April. I remember it well, and it was a project that was kind of a no-brainer for me. It seemed like a very urgent and obvious thing to do, and I felt that especially after attending Teresias' funeral and the service and the memorial services, which were incredibly moving. But it was an indication of Terry's, how many people she touched and how important she was and how important her work was. So I came back here after the funeral thinking that this book project, which I think April had mentioned early, was something that I should put my energies into. And it was also a timing issue because, you know, Kati was dealing with the aftermath of her sister's death. April was running the whole program, taking on all those PhD students that Terry had worked with and so on. So it happened that I was in the last year of my directorship at CPIS, about to hand over to Tara, and was contemplating retirement not too far down the road. So suddenly space opened up for me, it seemed, to take on projects. And this was one that I was very committed to. The problem was that it wasn't my idea. So April quoted when we were talking earlier last week, she pulled out the emails where I broached the topic, and it's sort of 3 lines of apologies before saying, can we maybe get on with this? You know, the team, April and Kati and myself, again, it seemed pretty obvious. Both April and Kati had been students of mine. We had a professional relationship since then, and it felt very comfortable that we would work together. And for the most part, I think it was. We had a few rough moments, but not many over the years where we pulled this stuff together. That was the challenge. You know, when we started putting together what Terry had published, we realized that there was a huge amount. Actually, we were asked to do a bibliography for the Journal of Pacific History as part of their memorial. And so that got us started on actually collecting what she had published, and it was enormous. So the challenge was, how do we shape this? How do we narrow it down to 100,000 words, which is the PIMS requirement? And I think the others can chime in, but I think what the sort of turning point was recognizing the thematic markers that are in the book that allowed us to group Terry's work in various ways. I think that was a breakthrough. So the idea, obviously, Pacific studies, militarism, military and gender issues we put together. I think they may have been separate at the beginning, but it seemed to make sense to put those together. And then what we called Native Reflections, where she reflected on her role as an Indigenous woman, as an Indigenous scholar, and so on and so forth. So that, I think, was how we were able to organize what was a vast body of work.
April, your thoughts on this?
You're mute. You're mute.
Rookie mistake. Never too old to make the rookie mistakes. I was just saying that it was very hard and that word limits are one of the most painful things known to this academic life we lead. I was just echoing what Terence and Kati have said. You know, once some parameters were set, for instance, getting rid of the co-authored pieces and focusing the first volume on sole authored work, that carved a number of things out. Some of the smaller pieces that were introductory, sort of introducing volumes, we carved out. I think Kati had already mentioned, you know, the focus on literary work and artistic criticism, thinking that I think it became easier, Kati, would you agree, to carve those out once we thought that there would be a second volume? Like those will live again, and they will live in something that actually might even, and just, you know, plug for a potential future project, might even be able to take on a different sort of shape and form by working with artistic collaborators as well, and sort of showcasing those in something that might not be a standard academic edited collection in the same way, and could actually be quite exciting. I think it made that decision for some of that work to come out feel more okay. There were a couple pieces that I think, just for very practical purposes, the fact that we use this as a teaching text now in our theory and methods course in Pacific Studies, our postgrad or graduate course, there's a couple pieces that we always assign to students that aren't in there, either because they're co-authored or because they were just too long, or for whatever reason we cut them out. So I just have to add those to the reading list separately. It would have been very handy for me to have those in, but other than that, I think, I don't know, I'd love to hear what other people's thoughts, and maybe if people throw things into the Q&A, I'd love to hear people's thoughts, people who have engaged with the text, on their feelings about how it holds together as a volume. Just even some of the interesting decisions that were made at different points about what order to put things in. It was largely chronological, but then there were some that just didn't make sense to put chronologically, and so they might be put at the beginning of a section or somewhere later. So yeah.
Kati, the next, I know you talked about her creative work already, and April just mentioned, you know, the possibility of another book project that would bring together all of that. And perhaps we're preempting that project. But what are some of your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so people would be, and I'm just looking on my bookshelves to see if I have a copy here, but maybe actually it's at home. But, you know, people will remember her first book, which was a book of poetry, which was Searching for Ne Nimanoa, which was very much about exploring our connections with Kiribati, and then trying to kind of like positioning herself on a very complex, multi-layered landscape of Tabitiwean, Banaban, broader Kiribati, Rambi, Fiji, African American, East Coast US, feminist, gendered kind of landscape. And so that was her first, really her first attempt to bring lots of her thoughts in writing together. And I think I was still a teenager. I can't remember, I can't do maths, but she came to me when I was quite young with all of her ideas for this poetry. And she asked me to illustrate, to like try to bring different things together and think about how I would respond to this through illustration, because I was always the person who was drawing in the family. So since I was little, Terry was always speaking and writing and reading, and I was reading, but I was reading comic books. I was reading, you know, like what my mom considered to be very low literature, and Terry was reading other things. So I was the artist. We were all dancers, but I was the sort of seen as the visual artist in the family. So she brought her words to me, and I illustrated kind of like a front piece for the book and different sections for the book. So I don't think I understood at the time what any of that meant, because again, I was just sort of like little sister drawing for big sister. But later, when she passed, I went back to that book and I opened it and I was like, what an honor it was for her to ask me to respond to her incredible writing that then went out into the world and impacted and resonated with people in so many ways. So when you look around, it's her poetry and her poetic words that kind of pop up all over the place around the world. These are like, people are interested in lots of different dimensions of her work, and in some of her signature pieces like bikinis and other specific notions, etc. But her poetic writing has traveled in other ways. And so I sort of came back to that, like, oh my gosh, my big sister, who is kind of amazing, asked me to illustrate, which meant she was already thinking about artistic responses to her words. So then when we were thinking about what to do with all her poetry, I thought, I'm going to go back to that thing that she did with me when we were young and I was really young, where she asked me to respond visually to her words. So that's the kind of thing I would like to do with her literary works, with her poetry. I think we would have to think a little bit more about her literary criticism and things that she's done, co-authored, with people like Joy and others, her Black Atlantic sisters, and the kinds of poetic and Black feminist exchanges that they were having amongst themselves. I think we would have to think a little bit more about how to incorporate that in together with other sorts of artistic responses to her work, such as the visual. There are scholars who've done choreographic responses to her work. They have responded to her work and to her inspiration through dance, for example. So there's a lot of thinking to be done in that space because it's a multimedia. It's almost like requires a multimedia sort of thinking, whereas her already published textual works could be managed more within the textual format of the Pacific Island monograph series. And we could kind of like just keep that text together as one sort of gift, to the world for people who loved and are actively using her work. I mean, we know already there are projects out there that are trying to document Teresia Teaiwa's thought and legacy. And so we thought this could be one contribution to that, and also to help and support those who tried to put together an open access bibliography of her work, which we quickly discovered. And this actually popped up right after she passed away. So that was it was a bit like, whoa. There were so many gaps and holes in the open access one that was wonderful, but didn't do justice to the sheer scale of outputs that Teresia had, had out there. So this helped in that respect, in terms of, just to show the breadth of her work and the impact of her work. But there's much more to do, as April and Terence and yourself have mentioned, coming out of that space where you were New Waves collective together, and you were all thinking and composing and performing together. I think there's quite a bit more discussion and thought to go in that sort of space. So this is definitely step one. And my younger sister and I, and our niece, Kea, who was very much connected to her auntie. They were both born in August and have kind of fiery canoe vibes about them. We are working on the launch of a Fiery Canoe Foundation, honoring Teresia and the broader Teaiwa legacy. So that's another project that's going on simultaneously, along with the thinking about the poetry. And yes, really very interested and needing feedback on how people feel about this particular collection.
Thank you, Kati. A lot of projects to look forward to in the future. The book is doing well, actually, and I'm saying this from the PIMS point of view. And it's not only in terms of the books that PIMS and UH Press are selling, but also in terms of, more the sharing of her scholarship. And a lot of people getting hold of the book and using it, which leads me to my next question of discussion. When you were putting together this collection and thinking through what to include, what not to include, the kinds of constituencies for her work, the impact that it has and the influences, and perhaps I can start with you, April, and think through, who were you looking at? Was it just Pacific scholars or scholars beyond the Pacific, or people not in academia who could pick this work and find it useful?
Kati's smiling because she's noticing what I've got up in my background while she was talking. I was like, let's see if I can be very clever. This is one of Katerina's illustrations for Searching for Ne Nimanoa, Teresias' original collection of poetry. So I was quickly trying to be clever and put a little screenshot as my background. I'm sorry that I'm blocking it. I've been trying to sit over to the side here. But this is for the first section in the book that is titled Within the Blood. So the blast from the past there, Kati. In terms of constituencies, I mean, going back to those memorials that Terence had mentioned, I mean, I think what is just continuously mind-blowing for everybody was just, you thought you knew the extent of Teresia's vast constituencies, but you never did. You would have some complete unknown sector of society that you didn't even realize she had a connection with that would come up and testify to how she single-handedly shaped the development of their whole organization that you had never heard and never knew that she had a kind of an impact on. But I mean, there were obvious constituencies, and Kati had already mentioned how foregrounding her sustained engagement with what it might mean to be doing work in Pacific Studies, and that question of what makes Pacific Studies. We knew that we wanted to foreground that work. And so in the organization of the book, the first significant section is about Pacific Studies and her work that's engaging specifically with the field and with learning and teaching in Pacific Studies. And then I think also what was just an absolute must for us was honoring also her sustained engagement as a feminist scholar of militarism, to focus on her work on gender and militarism in the Pacific, dating all the way back to, well, even before the very well-known and oft-cited article, Bikinis and Other Specific Notions, but dating all the way back to some of her earliest graduate work, Micro Women, US Colonialism and Micronesian Women Activists. So the second section definitely had to be that. And also I think we had many conversations acknowledging Teresia's desire to publish her monograph on Fiji women soldiers, her Royal Society of New Zealand Marsden funded project on Fiji women's experiences in the British Army and in the Fiji Defense Force. And the fact that that monograph didn't come out, but Teresia did have articles arising from that work, it was really important to us to both honor that longer sustained trajectory of critically looking at gender and militarism, but also to ensure that we had the most recent work reflecting the Fiji Women Soldiers Research Project in there. It was a chance to kind of pull that together. And then the final section, I mean, I think the final section is most interesting because it's a bit of a mixed bag, but it's, for the most part, things that don't fit within either of those other two sections as clearly, although I do think there's one essay there that could have been in the Pacific Studies section the more that I thought about it. An essay called The Ancestors We Get to Choose, which arises very much out of her teaching of our third year course. But for the most part, I think, and Kati will speak really eloquently, and in some of our planning around this, about how that was also a space for the ways in which Teresia did weave in those reflections about Banaban and about ancestry, and a chance to talk about, in a scholarly and critical way as well, but the ways in which she was reflecting critically on indigeneity, on being Banaban, and on other facets of her identity. So I don't know, maybe if I can just pass the torch to Kati, just pick up on that and speak more to that third section.
Yeah, Kati.
Yes. So, I mean, I think my sister's work is so interesting in that, you know, a good portion of it is about the Pacific and about the rest of the Pacific and what's going on, you know, in different corners of the Pacific. And then there's a really specific, there are specific essays and there are specific poems where she really tries to explore what it means to be Banaban, I-Kiribati, African-American, and have all of those things happening, you know, in one family, in one body, and really trying to work out that journey and what that means in terms of how it intersects with the academy, with the institution, geographically, etc. So she really gets into her positionality and subjectivities, you know, in some of these pieces, and tries to then work out the politics of it all, the gendered aspects of it, and also, I guess, harness it in order to do decolonial work, you know. So she's been doing all of that since the beginning. And I think, you know, bringing in some of her experiences from Trinity College in Washington, DC, and the kind of like Black feminist positionalities and subjectivities she was exploring there, bringing that then into the Pacific and having that be in conversation with, you know, Banaban women haven't been given very much attention at all in the fairly small body of scholarly work that's ever been done on Banaba. And so she could feel and sense that great absence because she was coming from quite a strong feminist and personal scholarly positionality. And she was looking for that in the Kiribati and the Banaban literature, not finding much at all. And in fact, when she went to Kiribati and she had all her experiences on Tabetewea and on Tarawa, you know, she came back out and then ended up working on Last Virgin in Paradise, you know, which she ended up co-authoring with Vilsoni Herenga. And that's a whole nother piece of her work that, you know, is not in this book and is a whole journey into drama and theater of its own. But that was her like making these observations about the positionality and the role of women in these different spaces, and then trying to articulate what that meant for her. Coming from the kind of complex family that we come from, and then trying to make her way through it's what can often be very difficult and devastating institutional spaces. So while we're talking about how much she was celebrated and honored by so many, I don't want us to lose a sense of the fact that what she was doing and the spaces she was operating in were also quite awful and hard for her. Many times, you know. So I think, you know, whether it was in a particular classroom or in a particular building, or once she had academic positions, life wasn't easy for her all the time at USP, right? Being a young, smart, feisty, passionate woman, that didn't go down well with a lot of senior academics at all. You know, Epeli Haofa was one of those who was like, love this one. This one's awesome. You know, so Epeli was one of, you know, a few senior academics who liked Terry's fire and passion and energy, but not everyone else did. And the same at Victoria University of Wellington. She wasn't always fully supported in what she did by senior people, including senior Pacific women. So I'm just going to put that out there because she was navigating all of that on top of the fabulous outreach and impact and working in poetry and scholarly works and theater and, you know, a gajillion other things. She would do the readings at church, you know, at the Catholic Mass in her local community. She was doing all of that. She wasn't always supported. So her powerful voice was about speaking back to and empowering herself as she navigated what was some positive and wonderful spaces and some really difficult, really negative spaces and relationships that she had to. And that's what made her voice so strong and her positionality so unique, because she managed to do it while invoking the vastness of Oceania and everything within it simultaneously. She was working at all of those levels all of the time, and she definitely didn't get enough sleep.
Thank you, Kati. Terence, your reflections on the constituencies for Terry's work.
Just before I say a few words about that, just to echo what Katerina just talked about at Victoria. What was stunning, actually, was that she was given a posthumous promotion at Victoria University of Wellington, my alma mater, a place I'm very fond of. But I was approached shortly after she died by senior administrators telling me that they were pushing through a promotion for Teresia and asking if I would write a letter in support. And I think that was a belated recognition, Kati, of the exactly what you were talking about. But in terms of constituencies, I mean, I've obviously followed most closely her work on Pacific Studies, building a program, her work on the intellectual contours of Pacific Studies. I think she had a greater impact than anybody. Her work on pedagogy, on actually teaching Pacific Studies, on doing Pacific Studies in the classroom. I don't think anybody has really written in the way that she has about that. But some of my, going back to what April was saying, some of my favorite pieces in the collection are actually in the last section. Scholarship from a Lazy Native, I still think is wonderful. And I remember that Katerina, I wasn't aware of it, Katerina, when she was a student, gave me a copy of it. And it was a really bad copy. It had her scrolls, Kati scrolls all over it. And that got photocopied and handed out to generations of students in 601 in our introductory MA course. But students found that really interesting, the way you navigate as an Indigenous person, the holes of scholarship. So I think there's a lot of interest in this book. I personally feel very good about how it's came together in the end. I also wanted to say before we finish that one of the reasons we chose to go with the PIMS, with the monograph series and UH Press, even though it's not a monograph, you might have noticed, is that we knew that it would do justice to Teresia's work in terms of the quality of the publication. The editorial work that went into this volume with people behind the scenes like Candy and Jan, it's not often that you get that level of attention in publishing houses now. So we knew it was going to be a quality production, and I believe it is.
And I think, PIMS is really proud to be part of this project. And I think I speak on behalf of the editorial board in that. This has been a really wonderful conversation, a really great Talanoa, but I'm conscious about time as well. And I just want to give the three of you final reflections, and maybe we'll have questions. I'll refer back to Craig for that. But before we do that, any final reflections from the three of you, maybe starting with April.
I guess since I didn't say it earlier, I just really want to express thanks to everybody in the process. My co-editors, to you as the Pacific Islands monograph series editor, Teresias, and all of the staff who did, as Terence said, such a beautiful, caring, detailed, committed, and extraordinarily attentive job, because a lot of that, the practical work of putting out the volume happened entirely on the University of Hawaii end and within the center there. So I just wanted to thank everybody because, you know, it was an idea and it was a good idea, but it was really a lot of the practical labor that happened there, and that very caring, loving labor from a huge constituency of Teresias, people that knew and loved her really well, who really brought it to the stage that we're at now. I will speak in just one other way to the constituencies. I was also very gratified that in addition to the University of Hawaii Press imprint, a deal was made such that an imprint of the book was also published here in Te Whanganui Atara in Wellington by what is now Te Herenga Waka Press. I think this was actually the last book that they published under their prior name of Victoria University Press. So it was really wonderful that everybody understood and was on board with the idea that making the book more easily available here for her many constituencies in Aotearoa would be a good thing to do, and that's been really wonderful. I think there's larger questions, and we rehearsed some of these questions and we initially met about getting the book in other parts of the island Pacific and how that poses more issues. So these are all things to think about in terms of the limitations of circulation and how might we get it to others, especially in places like in Fiji. So those are my final thoughts and reflections. Just a deep, deep gratitude to everybody who worked so hard on this project and manifested it into being. Mahalo.
Thank you, April. Terence.
Yeah, this project was it was a privilege for me to be part of. It was a very important project for me. You've heard me say this before, it truly was a labor of love. And I think the three of us worked together really well. I have memories of sitting at 6 kp in Wellington with April, with a laptop open and talking to Kati on Zoom. I have memories of sitting with Kati in her office at ANU and talking to April on Zoom. So generally a very meaningful project for me, and I'm very grateful for being allowed to be part of it. If you can see over my shoulder, you may not be able to see, but on my wall, I have a framed copy of the cover of this book, which my colleagues gave me as part of my retirement gift. And they knew how much this meant for me.
Thank you, Terence. Kati, your final thoughts.
Yes, just want to echo all the thanks that April and Terence have shared for all the wonderful hands and hearts and care that went into this project. And I know there were many. And so we were really grateful, and Teresia's family is very grateful, you know, her parents and sisters and her children and her husband. We all really appreciated that you all cared so much and were passionate about this, and that we have this now as part of our treasures. And I do want people to reflect a bit on the cover of the book because there was a lot of back and forth thing.
Yeah, I remember.
The cover. So even that was a bit of a process where we went back and forth, and a lot of different ideas, and April and I sketched up so many things, and they're all significant. Everything on the cover is significant to my sister and to what was on her body. So these are her tattoos. They are there on the cover, and those were things she chose, to display on her body because of how much pride she had in her. Okay, yep, how much pride she had in her heritage. So I just want to also acknowledge what John has just put in the chat about the fact that we honor our wonderful activist scholars. But I hope, John, you don't mind if I just read your words. He said, there was something else about her that is rare and beautiful. She made everyone around her better at the things we did. She had a personal effect on so many, so that she really does live on as more than a memory. So I feel like that beautiful song that John and Heoli and Liz put together actually deeply captures what was extra special about her, and that is why we put that into our introduction to the book. It is the ending of that, because I think they managed to capture some of the things that we could not put into words about why she was so special. And the reason she lives on more than just the memories, because she's quite active on the other side. I'll just say that and put that out there. My sister hasn't fully left us and is inspiring so many in so many different ways. And again, her family at the funeral was like, my father actually said, who was my daughter? So we are constantly surprised by how amazing and impact and wonderful she was. And it is important to recognize that. And that is why we will continue to do this sort of work in her memory and support her legacy. So thank you. Mahala nui loa and vinaka vakalevu Sara and kampasin rapa to everyone who has been part of that journey and continues to be so. We and she acknowledge you and are so grateful.
Thank you, Kati, and Doshul Hana, to the three of you for sharing your time and sharing your passion, sharing your knowledge, and helping us share the scholarship that Terry has produced and shared with us. I'm working off my phone here, so I can't see the chat. I can't see anybody else. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it back to Craig. But before I do that, I would also like to take the opportunity to once again thank Craig, thank the Center for Biographical Research for organizing this, for putting this together, and for bringing all of us together. So thank you to you, Craig. Thank you to your center. And I'm going to give it back to you because I really don't see anything else apart from Kati's face. And so I don't know what's going on behind the scene. Craig.
Oh, Tarsus, you could do far worse than having to look at Kati through this whole thing. I would like to thank you all for participating. This is exactly what we hoped for. You gave a magnificent introduction to your own relations to a remarkable person, and also gave us really detailed information about how such a published tribute could come together. Zoe put a link to the book. I urge everybody who is still with us, and that's quite a number, to immediately go out and get the book if they don't have it already. I would like to thank our speakers for participating today. Kati, Professor and Deputy Director of the Higher Degree Research in the School of Culture, History and Language at the College of Asia and the Pacific at the Australian National University, and congratulations many times over for that magnificent award as the Australian University Teacher of the Year. April Henderson, Senior Lecturer and Director of Va'o Pasifika program in Pacific Studies and Samoan Studies at Te Herenga, Waka, Victoria University of Wellington, and Terence Wesley-Smith, who recently retired, congratulations, from the University of Hawaii after more than 3 decades with the Center for Pacific Island Studies, where he was a former director. I'd also like to thank Tarsus, who is an associate professor and director of the University of Hawaii Center for Pacific Island Studies in the tradition of Terence and many others before him. And I would just like to thank everyone who attended today And second, what Kati said about John Osorio's comment. For those of us who weren't lucky enough to know her as well as our speakers, I think we've gotten at least some inkling of just how important she is and should be. Mahalo nui loa and hui ho.